Hello, everybody, and welcome on a cold and frosty morning in England and the UK. My name's Nat Chalacoom, and I am the chair of the IOSH Construction Group. Today we have Joe Ryan, Head of Health and Safety at the Birmingham 2022 Commonwealth Games, and Ben Crabb, the Health and Safety Advisor for CDM during the Games. I'm going to basically hand over to them now for them to deliver their presentation on managing a world-class event, occupational health and safety for the Commonwealth Games. Just before we start, if you'd like to put your questions in a Q&A box, then that would be much appreciated. For those of you who would like to have a look at the presentation after the event, the presentation will be available for you to download from the IOSH website. And now I'll hand over to Joe and Ben.
Thank you, Nat. Morning, everybody. I'll just share my screen for you. So, yes, thank you, Nat. Welcome, everybody, to this morning's webinar. It's entitled Managing a World-Class Event, and we're going to talk you through our experience from the organising committee side of the Birmingham 2022 Commonwealth Games, and in particular, how we delivered the occupational health and safety, as well as leading into the CDM side of the work that we did. I'm Joe Ryan then, so I was formerly Head of Health and Safety at Birmingham 2022. I started at Birmingham way back in May 2020. I think I was interviewed before the pandemic started and then joined the organisation after the pandemic started, so it was a really interesting time. I spent approximately 2.5 years, or just short of 2.5 years at Birmingham. When I joined, there was about 85 people working for the organising committee. When we delivered the games, I think we're up to something like 54,000. That includes sort of workforce, contractors, volunteers, etc. So quite a large headcount there. My experience in the events and sports industry, over the last 10 years, I've delivered health and safety arrangements for 5 major games, including the Olympics, 2 Commonwealth Games, European Games and the Islamic Games, both here in the UK and overseas. And on top of that, about 20 plus World Cups and World Championships in various sports. So fairly well briefed in terms of health and safety for certainly the sporting events world. I'll just hand you over to Ben, who's introduced himself as well.
Yeah, morning all. So my name's Ben, and I joined a few months after Joe. It's probably about 8 months after Joe I joined. So I started. It's virtually this time, 2020 really. Then I came to the office in January 2021. So my background was I'd worked in construction side and health and safety, and more predominantly moving into events. So I worked on some large music festivals, but I also worked in some sporting circles as well. Did some stuff with Formula 1, Formula E, boxing, some football in there as well, and a few other bits. And so I was sort of second to come in. So Joe was taken on as head, and I came in to support Joe and predominantly pick up on the CDM and the construction side of the build. So that's a little bit about me. So I'm gonna hand back to Joe.
Thanks, Ben. Bit of an overview then, really, of the games and what we're going to talk about today. So it was widely known that Birmingham 2022 was the largest multi-sport event in the UK since London 2012. So straight away we realised and knew very much that we had a very big gig on our hands and a lot of work ahead of us. A lot of the public will obviously see the 14 competition venues that were delivered for the sport, which obviously during the games looked absolutely amazing. But behind the scenes, we had another 70 non-competition venues of all sorts of different kinds. We had 3 athletes' villages, so the concept there was very different. We had transport malls, we had uniform centres, accreditation centre, quite a lot of hotels to accommodate athletes, technical officials, team officials, and so on. And in the end, we had 72 countries attend the event with in excess of 5,000 athletes, with at least 283 different medal events. One of the most notable facts really about the games was that there were more women's events than men's for the first time on a global stage. I'll touch on the budget very shortly, but I mentioned the games time workforce in excess of 54,000, so quite a large cohort. And obviously, we were tasked with making sure that they were operating safely and were trained correctly. There was a record 1.5 million spectators who bought tickets, with a ticketing, TV, and streaming audience of over 20 million. So it was a pretty big deal. When I first joined, I looked at the health and safety budget, which was, I would say, quite low. It was around about 500,000, I think, and the resourcing that we needed was, I think, scheduled to come into the games about 9 or 10 days before the game started. So I had a complete look at that, revised that, and got a budget of £1.7 million approved, which myself, Ben, and the team set out to deliver all of those arrangements. What we're going to do today, though, really take you through how we set up health and safety arrangements for Birmingham 2022, and then that will lead naturally into the CDM process, which is obviously a very relevant subject for today's session. It's worth mentioning that not only did we provide the health and safety support for the games themselves for Birmingham 2022, there were other businesses behind the scenes that we supported as well. So we had Unbox, which was like the creative arm of Birmingham 2022, which I think is still running now, and was like a festival throughout the whole of the year. There's a United by Birmingham 2022, which is the charity arm of the games, again, which we actively supported with all the community events. And then there was Birmingham 2022 Festival, again, which we actively supported, but there were different types of events leading up to the games, the 2 year to go, the 1 year to go, and various festivals and smaller events around the city and the West Midlands as we led into the games. So the job was quite a big job, as you can well imagine. So our vision, like most visions, I guess, on major events like this, and we spent quite a bit of time actively promoting this, is to provide that harm-free environment. And we spend a lot of time explaining to everybody about the difference between harm-free environment and risk-free environment, and why we choose a harm-free environment. It is a quite simple concept. It's there really to make sure that people come to work, spectators come to the games, and they go home without injury or ill health. It's fairly simple. It's not rocket science, but it's very effective. The strategic plan. So when we first started, one of the things that we needed to do was really set out how we were going to approach the games, how we were going to set ourselves up. And we built this strategic plan. You can see the 5 headings there, from strategic approach, the governance and the leadership side, all the way through the sort of operational planning phase into the readiness and delivery stage, the games itself, and then as we came out the back, then obviously the dissolution and the D-rig and the wrap-up, and so on. And I'm not going to run through every single heading in there, but it's quite a complex process. But what this did for us was to actively set ourselves up in the right shape and the right way to deliver the games. Now, I wouldn't sit here and say that we were able to deliver every single element of this plan, but it gave us a very good baseline and a foundation to build upon. You'll see on a couple of slides coming up about the challenges that we faced, which obviously started to adjust the strategic plan in terms of what we needed to deliver and how we delivered that. But I guess on a major event, that's natural, and it's something that you'd always experience. But you can see all the way through there, it was really important right at the very beginning to get that leadership and the governance set up. We needed to get that active commitment from our senior management team and the exec team, with the policy development and management standards and so on, pushing that through so that we can actually get some traction as we go into the following sort of stages. As we looked at the operational planning, one of the biggest elements there, obviously we got risk management, that's an absolute given, but the resource planning was quite critical, and I'll talk about that in a couple of slides time again. As we flow through, we will talk through on the slides in terms of the CDM side of it, the build program and the decommissioning and so on, and what challenges that brought us. Okay, over to you, Ben.
Yeah, so like Joe was saying, we did have some challenges, but we tried to work around as best we can. But it's like all of you work in construction, you know that any construction build at some point will no doubt have its own little problems. The issue which we have obviously with a games as such as this is deadlines can't change. We've got this unmovable timeline where it's going to open at that time, at that date, with the opening ceremony, and anything else we can't flex. So it does put a bit of pressure on everyone involved. So our construction program, we did appoint 3 principal contracts and event. We called them turnkeys. You probably come across a turnkey term with work you do if you work in construction. And we appointed 3 arena events, GL events, and we also have Cube International as well. They did all our major builds, the conversions, redevelopments, etc. of stadium and venues for the use of the games, including the villages as well. And that all sat into an overarching CDM strategy. I know we'll touch on the CDM strategy in a bit, but to me, something I was tasked with to write, and to be honest, it's probably the most complex, biggest, and most detailed CDM strategy I've ever had to sit down and write. And it wasn't an easy process. It took nearly 9 months to complete that strategy. So it actually gave a clear direction for the games. It's the first time it brought a lot of different facets together and had been put into place as such for games of this size. So it's quite an achievement, to be honest. So it was good to have Joe's support and input on that as well. And we worked very closely with what we called VDO, Venue Design Overlay, which also gave the guidance for our health and safety documentation, but also we supported VDO in design, the procurement, installation, use, de-rig, wrap, etc. So we worked very, very closely. So we were one of those departments, functional areas we call them within the games, an FA, and we touched on literally every single facet and operation which was undertaken from right at the start of the games all the way through and into the de-rig and wrap, and some of the work which is still ongoing for games until it's closed down. So the construction program, it started a long way out for me, January 2021, and it's something for me which didn't finish right up until way past after the games, once everything was closed down, finished and handed back over. Next slide, please, Gary.
Okay, I was thinking about moving this slide a bit further on in the presentation, but I left it where it is because I think it's useful, and we'll touch on some of these points further in the presentation as we talk about some of the subject matter. But most of you, a lot of you, I guess, on this webinar would have experienced challenges from what you can see on the screen there. But obviously, when you're putting together a multi-sport event of this size with 84 venues, there's a lot of these factors here that pose some real challenges to ourselves. Brexit obviously was always going to be a challenge. That's very closely linked to the supply chain. So, what it did do, I mean, the documentation, the process, the change really slowed down that flow of commodities coming into the games. And I'm probably sure that probably a couple of our principal contractors are on this webinar as well, would recognise that and would have experienced those difficulties in terms of getting materials in on time onto the venues, and would have caused them considerable challenge. On top of that as well, and probably that connected to that, is the Ukraine war, affected a lot of movement of materials around the world. What I haven't added onto here is obviously the shipping incident in the Suez Canal, which also caused a few issues with containers being in the wrong place around the world. Supplies that we needed to travel through that route were affected, and ultimately delayed some of the products and commodities and materials that we needed to get onto the venue and in our hands. Labour market, I've touched on there, is probably one of our biggest challenges along with COVID. I'll explain the labour market when I come on to a slide very shortly, but getting the skilled resource that we needed was really, really difficult. Salaries in a number of different areas had pushed up, and we, I must say, probably weren't quite aware of that and some of the skills that we needed, and then ended up having to go out to advert on a number of occasions to get the resource that we needed. And our whole team, which is a team of 27, came in quite late, but I will talk in very shortly about the detail. COVID all the way through was a massive challenge. Early days was a big challenge. We spent probably the first year of our time at Birmingham working from home. And as the team grew, we had one office which held 800 people. We then took on another office which held a few hundred more people. Then we took a third office, and all the time we had to prepare those offices, not just from a COVID perspective, but to prepare them ready for people to come in, because we couldn't deliver the games working from home. You just can't simply deliver something like this while you're working from home. You need to get people in around the room, talking about the issues, getting onto venue. So one of our jobs was not just to make it a COVID secure venue, was to give them that environment to enable them to do their work in. That added a lot of pressure to the team, but it's one of those successes that I really feel proud about, that we achieved that with a number of people working in collaboration to deliver those environments to get people in. And obviously that landscape was changing all the time. When we're looking at PPE, for example, we started out by calculating I needed to order 5 million face coverings. In the end, I think we ordered 100,000, but the landscape kept changing. Security checks was a big issue for everybody within the games. And this is the security background checks that we have to go through to get people, get their accreditation. It was slow, it took a long time, and then we suffered from people, certainly on the opening ceremony night, failing their security background check, and we were left with 4 people short within our team with no time to remedy that problem. So that causes a lot of issues. Some of you may know or may not know, but Birmingham 2022 was set up as one step removed from local government. That brought in a lot of bureaucracy, and our processes to get decisions, get things signed off, to get approvals was a lot slower than you would normally expect. And that causes a lot of issues and really slowed our progress down. And ultimately what it did, because we're opening on the 28th of July 2022, we had a fixed deadline that wasn't going to move. So our deadlines and the time that we had the opportunity to get things resolved was getting shorter and shorter and shorter, which put pressure on a lot of the team. And we will also talk about the regulatory engagement, which didn't kind of pan out how we wanted it to pan out. Really what we wanted to do was get early engagement with the regulators. Obviously for construction, it was the Health and Safety Executive, and then for the sport and leisure activities, it's the local authority, environment health officers. We had regular meetings called JARS meetings, which was the Joint Authority Regulatory Service. They were reasonably okay, but weren't really talking about the subjects that we wanted to talk, and we didn't get engagement on the construction side from the Health and Safety Executive until the incident with the structure at Horse Guards Parade. And then suddenly Health and Safety Executive were really interested in what we were doing and came down, which was, it went against the principles of what we wanted to achieve, and then put pressure on everybody because it was reactive as opposed to being really proactive and a very transparent and collaborative process. Back to you, Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So one thing which was set out was our strategy outline. As Joe's already said previously from that strap line, we set out a safe games, and that was for everyone, whether it was staff, athletes, spectators, members of the public, anyone who sort of came, it was to be set out as a safe games. There was that assumption that leadership commitment, and to be honest, the buy-in from our CEO Ian Reid, to be honest, he was such a great person to work with, Ian, and his buy-in right from the very start was amazing, to be honest. I know Joe worked with Ian for a few months before I joined, but there was nothing which seemed to be a challenge for Ian to say, and his support towards us to make sure that the health and safety strategy was implemented and it worked. I've just had a quick look in the questions, and it's nice to see you on here, Mark Breen. And one of your questions was, you know, how did you increase the budget from 500,000? And to be honest, it was that close working relationship with Ian, the CEO, and the board. And normally, once Joe went and asked, or we went together and said this needs increasing, there was never no, it got knocked back. It was, they could see the benefit of the health and safety, what we were trying to do, the overlay of the complexities, and how we had to meet that strategy. So from that perspective, that working relationship was amazing to make sure that this strategy could move forward, and we could focus on those proper risks we needed to, but to keep all the workforce and other people safe. That's from the working practices, but also that overlay from the COVID aspect. From the day we had the pingdemic in the office after going and seeing the Euros, and we had about 150 people leave the office from being pinged. We still had to look after everyone, and that buying, that strategy was a strap line all the way through, and we saw it all the way right up to the end of the games on the venues, in the athletes' villages, any of the other additional training venues, transports, etc. You could see it then. It was working really well, and especially that engagement from the whole team. And I'll be honest, I think part of this strategy worked because of how myself and Joe were. We would go around the office, we would get up at our desk, we'd go and talk to people. And to be honest, the team we had in as well, the first folks who came in and started, Jane, Karina, how they engaged with teams as well was absolutely fantastic. And it was because of that proper, decent selection of a team and how everyone worked together. They knew if they could come and ask us a question, it wasn't a hassle. And how we went round and spoke to different people anyway, even just over a coffee or saw them out and about, we would talk. And that really helped engage with that strategy as well. You want to move on to the next slide, Joe?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I'll just quickly jump in there as well. I've made a note, Mark, and I'll come back to that budget question as well at the end, because there's a few bits that I could share with you. Over to you, back to you, Ben.
Yeah, no worries. So we adopted our policy from another number of different aspects, the best practice principles, the helping Great Britain work well, the HSG 65, that documentation. So we did pull a number of other documents to create this one-page, statement in effect to ensure that the strategic approach was correct. We had a HSMS in place. We set up a full HSMS system. We did have it externally validated, so we had external audits to come in and went through all of our policies and processes, etc. And that just ensured that what we were saying from that professional aspect, we had that checks and balances in place, just to give it that bit of extra kudos to say, we've had it checked, it does work. We did work, in effect, the whole of the system was set up to ISO 45001. Although something we looked at and we did say we might go for that certification, unfortunately, the time and the pressures of the project and delivery, unfortunately, we did not manage to go for the full ISO standard, but it was run from that strategic approach from ISO 45001. And that leadership, the stakeholder engagement, the board, how they worked, the CEO, the other managers, the culture which was instilled within the whole of the organisation, and that striving for continual improvement and the health and well-being. It was a significant strapline, and it was there all the time. There was no point where it was lost, shall we say. People did come and they asked those questions. We made sure it was there, and it was so instilled in the games. It was really, really nice to see, and just how everyone engaged with us and we engaged with them. And it was, for me, from that health and safety perspective, we weren't seen as health and safety, stay away from, don't ask a question. It was really, really well integrated, and that strategic approach was vastly beneficial to us and the games as a whole. Okay, I'm going to finish there and hand over to you, Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Yeah, I think it's a good point that's made there. We used to walk a lot around the office talking to Gary and all sorts of people. And we really set the culture of what we want to do from a health and safety point of view as engagement. We set that ahead of policy procedure and all of that because we felt that we needed to break down those barriers before we got to all the sparkly stuff and all that kind of nicey stuff. We made sure that we had good engagement, that people were talking to us because they were a good source of information for us, and we made sure that we were set up to be really, really engaging, that people would approach us. I think it's fair to say that worked really, really well, but probably to our detriment as well, because we got so busy because we were approached all the time. But people, I think, the functional areas held us in high regard. If you talk to any of the health and safety advisors like Karina, like Jane, the guys that were out there on venue, they were pretty slammed because they were really engaged with the other functions and they wanted their support. But it did put those guys under a lot of pressure, and they did a sterling job in getting that over the line. this slide really talks about the safety leadership, which is obviously important to a lot of us. We had to get that active commitment, as Ben's already mentioned. Having Ian Reid as our chief exec was a really good thing for us, and I'll talk about that sort of structure very shortly. It did probably work slightly against us as we got towards the games, but everybody wants to get the chief execs here, and my line manager was Ian Reid, so that was really fortunate, and I spent a lot of time in the exec team and in board making presentations and so on, and a lot of engagement, active engagement face to face, which was really good. But as you can see there, you know, we set out strong safety leadership sort of protocols in terms of what we wanted and what we needed, because we knew we would need it as we get to the games, because we were dealing with all sorts of directors and we need decisions being made fairly quickly. And yeah, in the main, we got that. There were a few occasions, obviously, where it could have been better, but I think that's true to say with every environment that you work in. But could we have asked for more? Probably not. I think we had a really good exec team that were working with us across all the disciplines. So the safety leadership from the games was a very positive experience. Oh, back over to you, Ben.
Yeah. So in order to plan for the games, there was a number of things we had to put into place. We did introduce a standard method assessing risks. There was a standard assessment pro forma and documentation. We also had that integration of our safety advisors working with those key teams, so they could, you know, work out those risks to make sure that they were actively closed out quite quickly. The amount of risk assessments, the safe systems of work, we had a set of common standards we put into place, the documentation there, and we had those working standards so people could look at different aspects of work they were going to be potentially undertaking, so that there was a commonality and a set process, no matter which of those 84 sites in effect we were managing, whether there were builds going on or bump-ins, etc. We'll talk about that in a bit further. But in order to make sure we planned, it did take a lot of time to put the processes in place, make sure the paperwork was right, the whole HSMS system was correct, and that documentation. But once that documentation was in place, we'd identified common risks, created the common standards, etc. We avoided that duplication, which was really vitally important. It made it simpler. It made it more straightforward. It was complex and difficult setup in the start because there's so many different aspects to look at. But once it was there, there was this central store and bank of documentation, which was easy to access, easy to use. And it just meant that we knew it was comparable across every single venue. And we knew there was that standardization. And those documents, it says on that last line, it was all created. So we had the best games from health and safety aspect, from the engagement we had, and also where we were brought in so early on this games, that it can be taken forward into future games as well. And hopefully the bar we've set with this one and the documentation, it can be replicated on where it's gone out to Victoria for the next games. And hopefully, you know, it helps save them a significant part of work which we've already put into place. Okay, next slide.
Okay, yeah, so this really just sort of sets out the risk management strategy, and obviously what Ben's been talking about, a lot of our operational risks, but as most of you know, we obviously need to look at high level risk and strategic risk. Primarily, I think for ourselves, we focus quite a lot on the high level risk, and we're working towards like a high level risk map, which out of all the sort of the risks that we have present on the games, we identify through that which ones we think will have major impact on the games, whether that's issues with the temporary structure or an incident with a client group or whatever it might be, whether it's fire across a venue. We highlight what we think of these high level risks that are going to seriously affect the games and cause major disruption and problems for us. What we then do with that is then feed that back into our assurance program. So we allocate risk advocates at board level and senior management team level. So if it's a ceremonies piece, then Martin Green would own that, and he'll be the risk advocate for that risk. And then our job and the FA's job is then to make sure that we've got mitigations in place to minimise the likelihood and severity of something happening. And then we carry out some mini audits, make sure we've got some insurance in place along with our corporate standards to mitigate those risks. So you can see really in terms of our risk management strategy, our operational risks cover everything that's happening from our tasks and activities through to the venue design and so on, but also mapping through then to that big stuff really to make sure that we are in a good place. Now, it sounds fairly straightforward and easy. It's difficult to apply because it's quite complex. It's quite challenging. It needs a lot of auditing program and labour intensive and so on. But it's good to pinpoint those high level risks. Otherwise, you end up being that sort of a jack of all trades, master of none, and trying to focus across everything without focusing on the real big stuff that's going to have major impact. Now, talked about resourcing. This was a challenge. We had a team of 27 in the end. But there's a number of factors here. I think we had a very strong team, very committed team working for ourselves. The central team in particular, who we've mentioned already, worked extremely hard. And I would say it's probably only now, 3 months down the line after the games are finished, that we're able to actually look back and look at it positively to say, wow, look what we achieved. And, the games was delivered, the public loved it. Birmingham City Council thought it was absolutely amazing. But at the time when we're deep in there with those guys, it was really tough. We can't hide that fact. It was extremely difficult. And if I did this again, then I think I would look at the resourcing slightly differently, because I think as much as we had 27 people in the team, we were under-resourced, probably by about half to a point. The competition schedule that we were working to, and the resource plan was set up based on what we did at previous games, and it was one advisor per venue. It was never enough. The competition schedule in some venues was extremely long. You're probably talking 18, 20 hours a day that were actually operational on a venue. Now that, for a period of time, as much as the game's 11 days, is not sustainable for one advisor. And then with a lot of the functional areas needing our time on venue, we just don't have enough resource to be able to put 2 people on. But if I was going to do that again, that would be one thing I would say. I'll put my central team in. I get the games time advisors in that normally they will come in sort of 3-4 months out. I would put a second team in terms of a shift pattern. So probably 1 to 2 weeks out, so you can get them inducted and orientated properly on each venue, but you've got then 2 people per venue, so you can do that, proper rotation. Fire safety was another challenge. We had 2 excellent people working for us in Martin Bromley and Wayne Cook. That took quite a while to get those guys in, and we ended up going out to advert 3 times on that role. And this is one of the roles where we'd probably put the salary point and the costings slightly too low. And as a result of Grenfell, what we realised after speaking to one of the fire institutes was that the prices for those roles had really started to go up, probably around about 15-20%, I would say. So we adjusted that salary point. But anyway, we got the people that we really wanted initially, but it was just later than we wanted. That put us under pressure in terms of getting the fire risk assessment programme and all those arrangements rolled out. One thing, again, that was really good, you can obviously see you've got Ben's role there on the left. And Ben really, not only was he health and safety advisor for CDM and for the Greenfield site, was also working in partnership with myself. And we created that partnership. So Ben would deputise for me when I wasn't around or was tied up, but also was that conduit with the VDO guys. That's that integration piece. So Ben's role was really to be integral to the venue design team so that we could really focus on that CDM piece. I did mention about Ian. Ian was a fantastic CEO, and Annie there as director of CEO's office were fantastic. But as you got closer to the games, naturally their roles needed to be focused elsewhere on the game. So in essence, when we got to the games, we kind of lost that line management sort of support. We got it through the Games Operations Centre, but it wasn't quite what we needed. We needed a bit more. So I think the overall structure of that CEO office would need to be looked at in future games, so that we make sure that we're almost sort of aligned to the other functions who had like a director, an exec director, or a chief, which we didn't have. Okay, I need to speed up a little bit, I think, just conscious of time here, but this was a real challenge for us, and I'm sure our principal contractors, if they're on the call, would agree with us as well. The contractor integration was good. We created contractor safety integration groups, and we met with the principal contractors on a weekly basis to talk about the programme and health and safety arrangements and so on, and obviously sharing our information with the contractors. The problems that one of the problems we had really was with the Joint Authority Regulatory Service. It was run bi-monthly. We were only allowed to go to those bi-monthly meetings, but in between those meetings, the local authorities would meet without our presence, and that made it a little bit tricky because we could only meet with them every 2 months. The aspiration initially was to set up, because we were working with multiple local authorities, was to set up a primary authority. Obviously, Birmingham City Council were the lead authority, but there was a resistance to setting that up from a cost perspective. And what it did as we went through the games, it complicated getting corporate standards over the line. Whereas a primary authority would have given us that pathway into, say, Birmingham City Council, submit all our standards, and get signed off, and then it's shared across all the other authorities. Equally as well, in the JARS meeting, the very much more discussion points were really around licensed activities, street furniture, and so on. And very rarely was I able to get some of the big stuff that we needed onto the agenda, such as the CDM strategy and so on. And that only really started to appear much, much later on. And like I said, with Health and Safety Executive, we didn't really get any interaction with the Health and Safety Executive until after the Horse Guards Parade incident with the structure there. And then there was a whole raft of site visits that were arranged then, and really hurried sort of piece of work the HSE wanted to do to check that, you know, we had everything in place. And that just put a lot of pressure on ourselves and the principal contractors to host those visits and, you know, cover that off and make sure that they were happy whilst we're still trying to sign off and finish all the venues and structures. So that was a bit problematic. Back to you, Ben.
Yeah, so as Joe touched on, we had these contract state integration groups set up quite early on, so we could get those key partners together. We had those weekly meetings and catch-ups with Arena, Cube, and GL. But the contract state integrator group also brought together every single other contractor working with us, so they could talk to these turnkeys, the 3 turnkeys, but also together as one open forum, so we could get that cross-sector communications operating, so people knew who each other was. And so we could also discuss key topics at those meetings on a regular basis. And it did help, you know, define the safety process and practice, the paperwork needs in place, induction process, and it just gave us that really good forum. So from that perspective, it did work, the integration group, and it did open those communications, those channels. As we got nearer to the games, this had to drop off because we just did not have time in the program to have this continually running. Everyone was busy, so we almost had a drop in so people could send questions in. We also had advisors out on site where they could feed those questions in and up to us if they could not answer on site. Just to go back to the safety advisors we got in on venues, they were really good, some of the best people I've worked with, because they dealt with the questions at the venue level, which prevented some of that stuff coming up to us. And, you know, they were enabled to do that, and they worked really well. But this integration group was just that overarching to start off, which really set the standards and helped that cross communications. We'll flick on the next slide, Joe, just looking at the time.
Yeah. Well, we're going to move now into the CDM piece. Yeah, back to you, Ben. Actually, this one's yours.
Yeah. So the CDM, the phases and the strategy set out, we did have 5 phases for the games. We had overlay build, which was predominantly undertaken by the turnkey suppliers, GL, Arena, Cube, etc. Once they had significantly completed their work, we went into bumping. This is where the venue is handed over from the turnkey supplier to us as the organisation committee, B2022 in effect. This is where we start putting our stuff in, the wrap, FF&E as we call it, etc., bumping in toilets, concessions, etc., getting it games ready. So we take control of it and bump in. Once the bump in has finished, normally sort of 24 hours before we go live, it came onto game times operation, where it then went down to full lockdown, athletes, spectators coming on, etc. And as soon as it finished, we went straight into bump out. again, where we stripped our stuff out. And some of this was quite a short turnaround. Some of this was 48 hours to take our stuff out, sometimes 24 hours before we then handed it back to the turnkey suppliers for the overlay removal. And what that did is, by doing the overlay build and the overlay removal, it meant we had the high risk construction works being undertaken without any of our staff, athletes, spectators on those venues. So it helped identify that risk profile. So we had the high risk undertaken at those two main stages under the turnkey suppliers as principal contractors. Then we would take over. Some of this was quite complex. Some of it, we had multiple activities being undertaken at the same time. So, for example, one of the venues, which was cricket at Edgbaston, we had overlay, bumping, and training being undertaken at the same time. So we had to make sure the venue was segregated. Then we had the one-day venues, the cycling, etc., set up, taken down literally within 24 hours. And some of them, like Alexander Stadium or Smithfield, they were there for the full duration. So some of this was very, very quick turnover. So the venue was set up, taken down, and decommissioned before the end of the games. So some of this was quite rapid in its movement, but it did help streamline those risks. We flick to the next slide, Joe.
Yeah, so this slide really talks about to support sort of Ben's CDM strategy and the overall strategy for the health and safety team. The VDO team wrote an overlay health and safety requirements document for the principal contractors and for employers. And this set out, I'm just having a look at it actually. It's actually got the wrong detail on. I'm really sorry about that. I'll just talk through this. This document really set out a lot of the sort of stage gates, the design risk and design management sort of piece, all of those elements in terms of the resourcing and how the sort of CDM program was going to work, how the sort of communication between principal contractors and the OC was going to work, and so on, and what the auditing sort of program and inspection program would be of either temporary structures and all their processes and their work. So forgive me for that slide being incorrect, but yeah, this is a really important document. So we're really working towards those three documents: the strategy, the CDM strategy, and the VDO document, which set out our overall approach to managing the build phase and the de-rig and decommission. This sort of slide, this is really the CDM strategy. Now, it probably aligns to what Mark was asking really in terms of budget. If you can see, there's a number of points there. A lot of this stuff that we created here, one at the bottom was a collaboration of a number of authors. So we make sure that obviously we were the sort of key stakeholders and owners of these documents, and our partners really on that were the VDO team and the venue management team. Really important in terms of design and then managing the venues going forward. So it's important to get that collaborative working going. But we based it on a number of factors. Obviously, we're going to base it on the regulations, the CDM 2015, the Management Health and Safety Work Regs, but also from our historic information that we had access to and the games that we worked on in terms of Glasgow, in terms of back in 2015, and then the Appendix 4.1 Turnkey Supply Master Health and Safety document, which is part of the tender programme. So it wasn't as if we were starting from scratch. It was based on our learnings from previous games, what worked, what didn't work. But ultimately what we're trying to do here was actually create a one-stop shop in terms of this document, so that it did everything, as opposed to having a CDM strategy, an end-to-end plan, etc., etc. It's all in this one document. Similar to the VDO health and safety and CDM standards, which I've talked about, it was then designed to assist and inform the contractors and suppliers and to outline those expectations and the requirements. Everybody's clear as to what needs to be done, how it's going to be done, and how it's going to work. There was guidance in there that applied to all the venues, and obviously the venues were very different. Looking at the different phases and making sure that all the safety rules are applied to each of the venues appropriately. And then ultimately was this what we call the venue health and safety handover plan or process. So as Ben alluded to with the different phases, we had this plan that identified where that responsibility would shift throughout those phases, and that was really important. So if principal contractors were involved or managing that venue, then there's obviously going to be a shift to the OC and venue management taking control of those venues. So I'm going to quickly skip on because we really are pressed for time now. We need to make sure we've got enough time for questions. You can see the extent here of what was covered on that health and safety document, but I'll hand over to Ben just to give a bit more detail on this.
Yeah, so we had a massive amount of requirements we needed for that overlay. If you look through that list, it's a significant amount to take into consideration for sort of all 84 sites which are being built simultaneously at the same time, or some being built and some being decommissioned. So there was all the things on there. You can see stuff in there: the CDM compliance, change control, fire risk assessments, wind management plans, the bits we got with temporary demountable structures. The list, there's probably more stuff we could add onto that list which is on there, but as you can see from there, there was a significant amount of different aspects we had to take into account and put into place to make sure it was full belt and braces on what we were doing. It was no easy task. Can't say it wasn't, but we did work our way through it. If we go to the next slide, we look at that CDM strategy of how that was set out, which takes into some of those points on that previous slide. So literally from August 2021, we started the onboarding of the turnkey suppliers. We moved through to the delivery plan, the PDP, by the turnkeys. We set up the contract safety group, which started from September 2021. And they ran until September 2022 in effect. We started the mandatory all-staff construction site training. I know someone's put a question there. How did we do that induction training? It was a mixture of online, so people mainly did it online, and then that got flagged, so we knew they'd done the training when they got to venues. They then had a venue-specific induction, and then they could be let onto those venues. So they did an overarching induction, then a venue-specific induction, then they got updated daily by different risks which appeared on those venues as well. And as you can see through this, there was a significant amount of dates which also met some of the stage gate requirements which were set up for the turnkeys as well. And in a bit we mentioned stage gate to dates, but this strategy sort of mirrored the stage gates, but also set out what we wanted to see from that health and safety perspective, but also what we wanted other people doing, so we were ready for when we started taking on those venues and work started. So we knew what we needed into place, and when regulations may be deregulated, when we went to games time, or even bumping, and then when they were reinstated as we started moving through back to the turnkey, taking over the venues, and where those files would move to throughout that process. So there was a number of changes of the health and safety file between different parties, but it was make sure that people knew whose responsibilities were at those different times, but also where the validation would come from and who would be checking. And as you can see through there, predominantly it's between us and OH&S and safety, and also VDO, to make sure we had that dual tally and sign off to say we had all the stage gate information, we'd got the safety files in the right place, the induction's been done, and this was that safe process, so we knew who was responsible for what as we worked through these dates and this timeline.
Okay. I'll move through this fairly quickly, but I think I've obviously explained in terms of the handover process. I think you'll receive these slides after the presentation anyway, but this really sets out the different phases and the responsibilities, and as you can see how they shift from phase to phase, and in terms of that ownership, which is really important to make sure that we get that sort of liability and legal responsibility sort of aligned. I'm really conscious of time now, so I'm going to move through these fairly quickly. But this is obviously, as part of the plan, was to have a design strategy and plan which set out really our resourcing, the program, the key deliverables, and everything that's set out there, the engineering procedures. Is intended really to ensure that we maintain the approach on completing the design. And myself and Ben and the health and safety advisors were involved at this stage with the CAD drawings, having a look at those designs, because obviously one of our biggest factors is design at risk where we possibly could. So This was a really sort of important phase for us. It took a little while, I must say, to get people to buy into that, because we got a lot of questions back saying, well, why do you guys need to be involved right now? Well, we had to explain quite strongly the benefits of designing out risk and why we needed to be involved at that early stage. Sorry, Ben, you were going to present that bit.
That's right.
You can have this one.
So like Joe just touched on, that design risk right from the start, it's embedded in 2015 CDM regs, safety by design, right from that concept and idea. So it was built right in from the design risk assessments. We had a design risk register. These were also created by turnkey suppliers and submitted. It wasn't easy, and I admit that from the turnkey supplier perspective, it's probably some bits which caused some friction on those deadlines, getting stuff in, and sometimes it was these aspects which sometimes held up the program activity from both sides. To be honest, I can't say there's one person who was at fault with this. But we also had some red listed items from the HC RAG list, which had to be built into there, and these were sent out as well. So all of this sat into OB2, Open Book 2, for the completion. Say, yes, we've done design risk management, so we can move on to the next phases of the procurement and actual builds, etc. I'll go to the next slide, Joe.
There we go.
So I don't know whether you've seen these. We have these RAG reviews, setting out the different aspects. We would look at the different levels of risks which were associated with different aspects of build, and it gave us an idea of what we wanted to see, in place, how it would be represented on the risk register, and then what checks we would be doing and how often those checks would be taking place during the build and also after the build once it's been signed off and handed to us. There's quite a lot on there, so it's quite an interesting read. So have a look through this when the slides get sent out.
Okay, just very quickly, I mean, I'm sure you're all familiar with these, the construction phase plans, but obviously this was a very integral part of the strategy, was to complete construction phase plans for each of those venues. And as Ben's alluded to, late submissions allowing insufficient time ready for review, and ultimately, that would cause problems with hitting those deadlines and keeping the project on track, and it just applied pressure and squeezed the sort of timeline of opportunity to get things signed off. There are a number of factors as to why documentation and was late, and issues on both sides, I guess, really from the OC and then from principal contractor, probably from the factors that we mentioned earlier, that were external factors that caused difficulty for everybody concerned. Ultimately, these were produced well. The build programme went ahead on time, but obviously against those stage gates, in terms of requirements and what was set out, then put a lot of people under a bit of pressure. So it's not always plain sailing through these processes, and obviously with the number of venues we had, there was a lot of these plans that need to be submitted and reviewed. As part of that, we had a logistics plan. I'm sure you kind of understand, obviously, the complications and difficulties with this sort of stuff. But I've included this on the slide because it was probably a key risk for us. We had some challenging venues. We're working on university campuses where the principal contractors are trying to operate whilst the universities were still having students on venue, whilst we're still then trying to get the articulated lorries in for deliveries and drop points and load zones and all sorts of things. So it was a very complex process, really, really challenging to manage. But ultimately, I think with people on the ground and with the right approach, it was managed as well as it possibly could be. I'm just going to touch on the temporary structures very briefly. So this is a list here of all the different types of temporary structures that we brought in, and they're on obviously a red, amber, green assurance program, but you can see the scale there of the temporary infrastructure and temporary works that we brought in. Obviously we focused on some of the big stuff with the stands and various things like that, but there was a lot of commodities that were coming into those venues, and some of the venues, in particular the greenfield sites, were built completely from scratch. So you can imagine the extent of the work that was involved. As part of this program, we insisted on an independent check, so a third-party check on the structures for sign-off. So the principal contractors will carry out their supplier checks and provide that documentation, but also there are independent checks from the OC and from principal contractor side to sign off those structures, and that documentation then had to be submitted to building control to get approval before we were able to load those stands and those structures with people. I think it's fair to say that some of the structural designs were world leading, and I think a lot of the certainly the stands at the Alexander Stadium were an extremely good design, and I'd heard a lot of compliments really about those structures. So I think as much as a difficult build, they were extremely good structures that were built. And obviously on the back of Horse Guards incident, that was always something that was on the back of our mind, but we were very confident about the build programme. Yeah, I think I've probably talked about the infrastructure programme. It varied from major structures to smaller structures on that red, amber, green sort of programme as well. So I'm just going to move over that one. Touch on the fire risk assessment very briefly, and then we'll just get to the stage gates. Then we should be open for questions then. Fire risk assessments were, again, a complex matter. What we set out to undertake was 2 fire risk assessments. Obviously, principal contractors would undertake theirs for the structures, but we'd also carry out a fire risk assessment for the bump-in programme, and then would review that ready for games operations, because the environment's changing, people are different, and so on. So we wanted to make sure that we were belt and braces on that. So that was a fairly detailed programme that we undertook, albeit it was very late in the day because of the resource challenges that we were having. I'm going to skip over this one for time. We mentioned the handover plan. It was really important, the handover plan, from the sense of setting out where those transitions take place, where the responsibilities changed, and so on. And we did that for all the venues, but for the test events, and then for those transitions where we might have changed field of play, where we handed back to principal contractor, did a transition on field of play, handed it back to venue management again for next day operation. So quite a complex process as the responsibility shifted, and we went through those phases. And this is the slide I really wanted to get to, so I'm going to hand you back to Ben, who's going to talk you through the stage gates.
Yeah, this bit and that handover process previously Joe was talking about were the 2 key bits, but the stage gates was really integral, and it wasn't easy, and some of the stage gates were missed or delayed, and sometimes it was just lack of information from both sides. Sometimes we didn't have the information from the venues were taken over, and that put extra pressure onto VDO. Sometimes the information didn't get to the turnkeys, and sometimes the information didn't come from the turnkey. So there was no one point of failure. Sometimes there was multiple points which prevented these stage gates, but they all had to be met. So we would ensure that these venues were safe and how they were operating. So you can see on here we had 6 different stage gates: the completion of the venues, then the procurement stage going through stage gate 3. Stage gate 3 was design completion. And then stage gate 4 was a real important one, the pre-construction. This is the ones where we want to see all the calculations, the engineers' calculations, how it's going to be built, everything we wanted. And that was a real significant sign-off one. And that's the one which sometimes caused some issues and concerns. It went back several times between us and the turnkeys to make sure that this stage gate 4 was what it was meant to be, and every single aspect of that stage gate was completed. So we knew we had the confidence that all those safety aspects had been met, and we knew it was going to be correctly done. Once that construction been undertaken, we then had stage gate 5, which was the handover of the erected structures. This was the bit where this late engagement with the HSE also caused a little bit of problems from them wanting the pre-construction information, which sometimes wasn't always there due to the build phases, and then they wanted to see that the handover finished documentation from stage gate 5, which sometimes wasn't there because the venues weren't finished due to the time constraints of where we were trying to get those venues finished. But these 2 were really key, the stage gate 4 and stage gate 5, because that's where that full auditing process to say that's where those structures are and how safe they are. And then we moved into stage gate 6, which is dismantling, which in effect was a sort of a rinse and repeat of a reversal of stage gate 4. In effect, it was that decommissioning stage. So that stage gates, they were absolutely vital throughout the whole process of this, from the engagement with turnkeys all the way through until we had that full dismantle. And without these stage gates, it'd been very difficult to actually manage the whole of this process. So this was fundamental work between us and also VDO.
Brilliant. Great stuff. Thanks, Ben. Right, that's a wrap. That's we've overrun, I think, in terms of the presentation itself, but we're open to any questions if we do have time for the questions now. Nat, hopefully we still have time for some questions.
Yes, lovely, fantastic presentation. We will stay on for another 5 minutes to chuck out some questions. Those of you who've got to disappear, then please do. But and then if there are ever any questions that we can answer after the webinar, I'll talk to the presenters and see if we can do that also. So one of the major themes coming out there is basically, you know, if you were to do this again on the construction side of you, what would you change, although you had a very successful games?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it would certainly be, you know, the resourcing was a big issue for us. I think we're, as much as there's 27 people within the team, it was still too light. But you know, that was sort of benchmark against previous games, and that's always how it's always been. But I think there needs to be a real sort of shift there in future games of how the resourcing is set up. I think with Ben's time in particular as being the health and safety advisor for CDM and Greenfield sites, early doors worked because we were had low sort of numbers in terms of the workforce, but as things progressed there, we needed to switch that out, bring another advisor in for the Greenfield site, which took longer than we wanted, so that Ben could dedicate himself into the VDO team, because what we really need is that role to be absolutely embedded in that team, and that was the principle of what we were trying to achieve, was get our teams integral into those venue teams and into the right areas. So that is definitely something I would look at again. I think everything else I was quite comfortable with. I think the engagement and with the principal contractors, you know, what we've got to remember is that, you know, we were operating and delivering this in a really difficult climate. The events world was still getting back on its feet. You know, it posed a lot of challenge, and obviously we were working for local governments, so finances were always quite challenging. Is it possible? Should I just quickly touch on the budget question as well, which Mark mentioned earlier? I think we had benefit really from you know, an excellent chief exec, and David Grady, our chief financial officer, also was very supportive. We had that commitment early doors in terms of health and safety. The senior management team made it absolutely clear they would not compromise on health and safety. So that made my job a little bit easier when I went to them with a new budget to say, right, what you've got in the budget originally is inadequate. This is what we're going to need. And I got a lot of support. But I got the support also because that was built on previous games. We've done a lot of research looking at previous budgets. So we're taking what the Gold Coast had spent. We already knew what Glasgow had spent. And because I've done 4 games before, this was the 5th one, I knew what the commodities and what the services we needed to deliver this games in the main. And then I started to put the pricing and the costings together with that. But I think because we got that senior management team commitment straight away, it made it a lot easier to get across the line. Yes, with finance was a bit of a trade-off. I had to adjust start dates to try and save a bit of money in one area, but also move that money to a different area so we can get things started at the right time. But I think I would put it down probably from leadership support was the key factor. Excellent,
thank you. We've had a question about metrics and you know, a type of event like this, which is very fast paced and that. And are you able to benchmark and compare it with other games? And I suppose this would lead, you know, to the budget question. So, do you take metrics and can you benchmark?
Yeah, there's a lot of benchmarking that goes on from games to games. I think, you know, what we do, we have the transfer of knowledge. So each time we finish the games, all of our information goes into that, what we call the TOK. That goes on to previous games. So as part of these games, we had access to what we did at Glasgow, what happened in Gold Coast, what happened in Manchester 2002, and it all goes through the Commonwealth Games Federation into that transfer of knowledge. And then other games like Olympics, they do exactly the same. So we're able to benchmark that on everything, finance in particular. What I would say is the difficult bit to benchmark is the environment. We were operating at a really intense level for these games, so much so that I think it's affected a number of people. There's quite a few people, I think, that finished the games and said, I'm not doing another one. I don't think Birmingham was representative of previous games that I've worked on in terms of the intensity, but from a health and well-being point of view, the team could not keep up that pace for a long period of time, but we had to keep it going for longer than we wanted to. The pressure really came on much earlier than we anticipated it coming on, certainly on our experience. But yeah, that is something. Yeah, I guess you can benchmark to say, look, Birmingham to a degree was a unique event, and hopefully Victoria will be a little bit easier to deliver. The climate might be better, albeit cost of living has gone up.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Right, I'm having to stop it there, unfortunately. Lots of questions, but we will see if we can try and answer them in the future. The presentation will be available on the IOSH Construction mini site, so head over there, and we can also let you know when that is available. Lastly, I would like to say thank you very much. Have a very Merry Christmas to Joe Ryan and Ben Crabb. You fantastic presentation. We could have gone on for hours, so much to talk about, so much to go into, and we might follow this up with another one and just focus on a few areas. But again, thank you very much to Joe Ryan and Ben Crabb. Merry Christmas, everybody, and we will see you all in the new year. Thank you very much. Bye now.
Thank you, Nat. Thanks, everyone.